The words hung in the air like a spark in dry grass. Ted Cruz leaned back, smirking, confident the moment belonged to him. His tone dripped with the practiced arrogance of a man who'd mistaken volume for virtue. Maybe if you had actually practiced law, Senator, you'd understand how the Constitution works. The insult cut through the chamber, followed by a chorus of uneasy murmurs. Reporters shifted in their seats. Phones rose like a wave. Every camera was trained on her, waiting, baiting, daring. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The quiet was her weapon. A faint, knowing smile curved across her face as she reached for the microphone. Senator Cruz, she began, voice steady as steel wrapped in silk. With all due respect, I've taught constitutional law, while you were still trying to prove you could read it. The room erupted. Gasps, laughter, a flash of disbelief on his face. In that instant, the power dynamic flipped. The internet lit up within seconds, clips flooding timelines with a caption, "She ended him," in 10 words. But even then, no one realized this was only the beginning. Because what began as a routine hearing became a national lesson in humility. What unfolded in that chamber wasn't a simple policy debate. It was a clash of generations, ideologies, and moral philosophies disguised as committee business. On paper, it was a hearing about constitutional interpretation. In reality, it was a stage for power theater, and Ted Cruz arrived rehearsed for the performance. He knew his lines, his audience, and his angles. Every smirk, every interruption, every barbed question was designed not to seek truth, but to dominate the broadcast cycle. To him, politics had long been a contact sport played for the cameras, not the country. But across from him sat someone who refused to play by his script. She represented the quiet insurgency transforming American politics. Leaders who didn't shout, but showed. Her calm wasn't detachment, it was precision. Every measured pause, every unbroken gaze was a counterpunch disguised as composure. For viewers at home, that contrast was magnetic. By the end of the morning, political analysts were already spinning it as more than a debate. It was a reckoning. Would intellect finally pierce through the noise? Could composure stand against spectacle? Even conservative outlets sensed it. Something about her presence unnerved him. He couldn't turn her into a caricature because she refused to give him chaos. Meanwhile, the digital world crackled to life. Clips of his taunts spread across platforms. Headlines recycling his sneer, users mocking the déjà vu of another Cruz gotcha gone wrong. Comment threads filled with anticipation. Wait for her response, one viral tweet teased. You'll see why he stopped smiling. Every second of silence after his insult became oxygen for the moment that followed. Journalists sensed it. Staffers whispered it. Even his allies shifted uneasily in their chairs. The air carried a tension older than politics itself, the collision of ego and integrity. Because once she began speaking, the narrative flipped and the internet forgot who the aggressor was. For years, Ted Cruz had built a brand around brilliance, the kind that demands recognition, not respect. A Harvard law graduate with credentials as heavy as his ego, he cultivated an image of being the sharpest man in any room, the one who could dismantle an opponent with a single sentence. And for a time, it worked. He spoke in paragraphs meant for headlines, arguments polished for pundits, sound bites sharpened for applause. But what once made him formidable had curdled into performance. His intellect no longer served ideas. It served his reflection. Flashback to the 2016 Republican primaries. A younger Cruz, brimming with ambition, positioned himself as the ideological purist, the principled conservative who wouldn't bend to Trumpism. Within months, he was mocked on stage by the very man he hoped to outsmart. The Lion Ted chants followed him like a curse, and every attempt to reclaim stature since then had carried a whiff of overcompensation. He didn't just want to win arguments anymore. He wanted to remind America that he still mattered. Then came the Cancun debacle, the moment that rewrote his public image in the cruel shorthand of the internet. As Texans froze in darkness, Cruz fled to a resort. His defense, clumsy and hollow, only deepened the wound. To critics, It confirmed everything they'd suspected, that beneath the speeches and sanctimony was a man more interested in optics than obligation. From that day on, he was fighting not just political opponents, but the meme of himself. In Senate hearings, that insecurity took on a new form. Each session became an audition. One more viral clip to feed the algorithm, one more segment to light up primetime commentary. He framed outrage as courage, sarcasm as intellect, theater as truth. His questions were weapons aimed at trending tabs, not policy progress. He didn't seek answers, he sought reactions. And then she arrived. A new senator, young, composed, unbothered by his showmanship. In her calm, he saw something infuriating: control. She didn't play defense. She didn't rush to match his volume. To him, that silence read as weakness. To everyone else, it was power. When he mocked her credentials, it wasn't strategy, it was reflex. A man so used to commanding attention couldn't stand to feel irrelevant. He thought he could provoke her, corner her, extract a viral retort he could spin as victimhood. But arrogance makes poor armor against authenticity. What he didn't know was that she'd studied his patterns, anticipated his traps, and was prepared to dismantle him with precision, not fury. Behind the dais, aides exchanged glances. They'd seen that look on her face before, the one that meant she was finished listening. One whispered, almost under his breath, "She's about to make him regret it." Another nodded. Sensing history tilting in real time, the cameras kept rolling, their red lights blinking like beacons of accountability. Somewhere beyond the chamber, news editors were already drafting headlines, waiting for a spark. They wouldn't have to wait long, because arrogance, when cornered by truth, always folds under its own weight. And when she began to speak, even his allies leaned in, sensing they were about to witness a fall from grace. She never had the luxury of shortcuts. The daughter of teachers and factory workers, she learned early that every ounce of progress demanded proof. In crowded classrooms, she watched others speak over her, take credit for her ideas, and still, she never raised her voice. She learned instead to listen, to the silences between words, to the assumptions that revealed themselves when others thought she wasn't paying attention. By the time she reached high school, her debate coach called her quiet thunder. Public education was her forge. Books became shields. The Constitution, once an abstract ideal, became her compass. While classmates memorized it for tests, she dissected it like a living organism, asking why certain promises never reached certain neighborhoods. She saw injustice not as an accident, but as a system maintained by eloquent men who mistook entitlement for intellect. That realization didn't make her cynical. It made her dangerous to the complacent, to the loud, to those who thrived on chaos. Law school wasn't a stepping stone. It was an act of defiance. She refused to become another voice chasing status. Her degree was earned between late-night shifts tutoring students and weekends volunteering at housing clinics. She represented families who couldn't afford lawyers, tenants facing eviction, mothers whose only crime was poverty. Each case taught her the same truth. Dignity is not a luxury, it's a right. Her students remember her as unyielding but kind, a professor who began every lecture with the same line. The Constitution doesn't protect power. It restrains it. When she explained due process, she spoke as someone who had lived on both sides of the system, the ideal and the reality. She didn't just teach law, she translated it for the voiceless. By the time she stepped into the Senate, her resume wasn't polished. It was battle-tested. Still, pundits smirked. They called her reserved, too professorial, not made for television. But what they mistook for lack of charisma was mastery of self. She didn't need to perform outrage to prove conviction. She understood what generations of women before her had taught silently. Composure isn't submission, it's control. Those close to her say she moves like water, fluid, deliberate, impossible to contain. A storm in still water, one colleague said, recalling how she once dismantled a billionaire witness with a single question. She didn't corner him with accusations. She listened, waited, and then asked the one question that exposed every lie he'd rehearsed. The silence that followed was her signature victory, the sound of truth settling in. That discipline, that grace, that understanding of timing. She carried all of it into the chamber that day. Every struggle, every underestimation, every whisper that she wasn't tough enough became fuel. When Cruz mocked her credentials, he thought he was striking at inexperience. What he didn't see was the weight of a lifetime behind her composure, the quiet endurance of someone who had fought too hard to be rattled by arrogance. So when he mocked her credentials, she didn't defend herself, she dismantled him. Cruz leaned forward, elbows on the desk, wearing that familiar half-grin, the kind that said he'd already decided who the villain in this exchange would be. Cameras zoomed in, eager to catch the next clip that would dominate partisan feeds. His voice cut through the air, slick with provocation. Do you even believe in the Second Amendment, Senator? Or are you here to lecture us again? The jab landed like he intended. Cheap, rehearsed, calculated for applause from screens far beyond the chamber. A few staffers behind him smirked, sensing what they thought would be another made-for-television victory. But the woman across from him didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't reach for notes, didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, fingers interlaced on the table. The pause stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. Enough to make the air itself uneasy. Every camera caught the silence, but more importantly, every viewer felt it. The confidence to say nothing when provoked is a kind of dominance Cruz had never learned to recognize. And then, in a voice calm enough to cut through his volume, she answered, Senator, I believe in the Constitution enough not to weaponize it for clout. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just truth, laid bare with surgical precision. The committee froze. Even the usual background shuffle, pens, papers, murmurs stopped. A few aides exchanged glances, uncertain if they'd just witnessed a turning point or a warning shot. Cruz chuckled, his smile tightening. That's not an answer, he said, try to reclaim rhythm. But his tone betrayed him. The laugh was forced, the bravado thin. He leaned back, eyes scanning for allies. The script in his head was unraveling. She didn't press. She didn't need to. The silence that followed became its own rebuttal, echoing louder than his entire monologue. For the first time, the cameras weren't framing her as a respondent. They were framing him as the flustered aggressor. And just when the tension reached its peak, she leaned forward, eyes steady. And then she dropped the question that made his entire argument crumble. She leaned in toward the microphone, not to raise her voice, but to lower the room's temperature. Her tone was steady, deliberate, surgical. Since you brought up the Second Amendment, could you cite the first clause, the one that comes before the right to bear arms? The question landed like a quiet grenade. Cruz blinked, caught mid-preparation for a comeback that suddenly didn't fit. The air around him thickened. He looked down, lips parting as if to buy time. Well, that's not relevant. Her interruption was gentle but final, her timing impeccable. It's directly relevant, Senator, because it defines the context you just ignored, a well-regulated militia. You skipped the regulation part, again. The room reacted instantly. A ripple of gasps, a few audible laughs, one muffled "oh, wow." Even the camera operators, professionals who'd seen hundreds of hearings, adjusted their shots, sensing the pivot. Cruz's eyes narrowed. He shifted in his seat, flashing the polite, wounded grin that had become his shield in moments like this. Well, I think most Americans know what the founders meant. She leaned forward again, not raising her voice, but tightening the lens of her argument like a lawyer walking a witness into their own contradiction. You love quoting the founders, Senator, but somehow the parts that require discipline and responsibility always go missing. A pause, long, heavy, deliberate. The room fell into a suspended silence, the kind that happens only when truth collides with ego in real time. Cruz opened his mouth, closed it again, then stared at his notes as though they might rescue him. But the silence did what words could not. It framed him. Every journalist in the room knew it. Every aide scrolling through live tweets felt it. The moment wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a shift. Phones buzzed under the desks. Clips of her exchange were already uploading. One headline read, "Cruz meets his match." Another, "She brought the receipts and the calm." Within minutes, hashtags were forming. Hashtag militia clause, hashtag calm wins, hashtag teach Ted. TikToks looped the moment where he stammered. YouTube thumbnails froze on his incredulous face. Meanwhile, she sat back, unfazed. No gloating, no visible satisfaction, just composure, the kind that makes arrogance look juvenile. And as Cruz shuffled papers, pretending to regain control, she added one final note, her tone almost kind, but unmistakably firm. The Constitution doesn't need defenders who cherry-pick. It needs readers who comprehend. A soft hum of approval rippled across the chamber. Journalists nodding, aides exchanging glances, Cruz's own staffers shifting uneasily behind him. He forced a smile, reaching for a new line, but his timing was gone. The rhythm of control gone. The narrative gone. And as the camera zoomed out, catching both figures in the same frame, one tight-jawed and flustered, the other serene and still, it became the image that defined the hearing. By sunset, the clip had crossed 10 million views. Law professors dissected it on cable panels. Late-night hosts replayed it with captions like, "When calm dismantles chaos." Even conservative commentators struggled to spin it, some calling it a tough moment for Cruz. Others avoided mentioning it altogether. But for millions watching at home, it wasn't just political theater, it was validation. Proof that composure wasn't cowardice. That intellect could still win in a shouting match era. And as the trending charts filled with her words, well-regulated militia, discipline, and responsibility, the conversation had changed. Not about guns, not about party, but about the forgotten art of reason. And by sunset, the entire debate had turned into a national civics lesson. One Cruz never wanted to teach, that CNN replayed the clip every hour, each time with a new panel dissecting what just happened. The cheer in red. Cruz confrontation backfires. Calm wins the day. Anchors leaned in, half smiling, half stunned. "You can see the exact moment," one analyst said, rewinding the footage. "Right there, that pause. That's when the power shifted." Progressive accounts across X and Threads erupted with praise. "This is how you dismantle arrogance." Calmly. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. Even conservative pundits, caught off guard by the clarity of the exchange, conceded softly on air, Cruz walked into that one. By nightfall, the internet had turned the hearing into a cultural event. TikTok duets exploded. Creators reacting to her line about cherry-picking the Constitution with stitched applause and mock mic drop edits. One viral clip slowed her faint smirk to orchestral strings, the caption reading, "The sound of humility learning its lesson." It racked up 20 million views before dawn. On Instagram, stylized quotes of her words floated against minimalist backdrops. It needs readers who comprehend. Shared by celebrities, educators, even a few retired judges. Her follower count doubled overnight. People didn't just see a senator anymore. They saw a symbol, a face of poise under pressure. College debate clubs broke down the exchange frame by frame. "This," one coach told her students, "is what restraint looks like when it's backed by preparation." Universities began circulating the clip as a strategic silence case study. Educators online called it the most teachable moment of 2025. Hashtags like hashtag Civics Reborn and hashtag Composure is Power trended for days. Students who had never watched a Senate hearing before were suddenly quoting her line about comprehension. Meanwhile, Cruz tried to salvage the narrative. On a late-night Fox interview, he brushed it off as a difference in interpretation, insisting the media had exaggerated the exchange. But the internet had already decided this wasn't interpretation, it was exposure. Memes compared his Cancun vacation to his mental getaway mid-hearing. Political cartoonists redrew the chamber as a classroom, with him labeled the unprepared student. Even some of his longtime allies privately admitted it was a rough optics week. By the next morning, the Senate hallway buzzed with something different: respect. Staffers who had watched from the back whispered her name like she'd just set a new bar. And as news anchors signed off their coverage, one line began to echo across networks. For once, the lesson wasn't about politics, it was about presence. And while his legacy took a hit, hers began to rise beyond politics into something cultural. She didn't gloat. She didn't post a clever tweet or bask in the viral glow. While pundits debated strategy and partisans claimed sides, she simply returned to work, focused, measured, unmoved by the noise. When a reporter caught up with her outside the chamber and asked how it felt to humiliate Ted Cruz on live television, she paused before answering, her tone as steady as it had been that day. It's not about embarrassing anyone. It's about reminding people that truth doesn't need to shout. That single line ricocheted through the news cycle, echoing louder than any insult could. By evening, it had its own hashtag. By morning, it had become something more, a principle. Commentators began calling it the composure doctrine, the radical idea that in an age of noise, calm is defiance and grace is power. Clips of her response circulated with quiet piano underscoring. Her voice replayed over montages of public servants, teachers, and activists standing firm against chaos. She didn't just answer Cruz, one commentator said. She answered an era of performative outrage. Her calm wasn't silence. It was command. The difference between reacting and responding, between trying to win and actually leading. She didn't defeat arrogance by mirroring it. She let it collapse under its own weight. And that, more than any viral clip, was the story that resonated. People didn't share it because it was dramatic. They shared it because it was dignified. It reminded them of something politics have forgotten. That strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still. Because in that chamber, she didn't just school a senator. She reframed what it means to hold your ground. Arrogance is loud. Truth is still. Composure is power. By week's end, classrooms discussed it. Opinion columns invoked it. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the poise. And somewhere in the midst of the noise, a quiet shift began, a hunger for something steadier, more human, more real. And that's why this wasn't just a Senate hearing. It was a turning point for how America defines strength. Ted Cruz mocked her credentials, but what she said next left the Senate in shock, and the nation reminded of what true strength looks like. If you believe dignity is louder than arrogance, share this moment. Subscribe and stand with the movement proving that calm isn't weakness, it's strength. Because in a world full of shouting, composure is the last rebellion. The screen fades to black as a soft orchestral cue rises, her calm smile frozen mid-frame, the image of unshaken grace. Caption appears. Composure is power. Truth doesn't tremble.